Hi, I'm Jack Deasley and I'm a PhD researcher at University College London and a member of Comprehensive Future. I'm here today with Peter Mandler, who is, until last year, a Professor of Modern Cultural History at University of Cambridge and a patron of Comprehensive Future as well. And we're here to sketch out a history of academic selection and grammar schools and situating that in the contemporary context so that all of us at Comprehensive Future, those that are allied with the cause, can talk about it in the most effective way possible. We're debunking some myths and talking about it, and I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Okay, so we'll start with that early period then. And when we talk about an early period, it's the late 19th century in terms of secondary education. So what happens in that period where we're moving from a spell where not that many people are in education, certainly not for very long, and when they are, it's elementary education. Can you talk to us a little bit about that to give us some context?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that most people are most surprised by about the history of education is how recent even secondary education as a universal entitlement is. Right up until the Second World War, only about 20% of the population had any experience of secondary education. So that means that if you're my age, I'm 68, and if you're a typical Brit, which I'm clearly not, but if you are, your parents were highly unlikely to have gone to secondary school. And so, yeah, the history of mass secondary education is a history of the last few generations. And before about 1900, I mean, first of all, there was no state-provided secondary education at all. There had only just begun to be state-provided elementary education, and most people left that at the school leaving age went up bit by bit, 9, 10, 11, 12, went up to 14, 19, 18. But even then, most people stayed in elementary school until they were 14, then left and went into the workforce. As late as 1938, only about 14% of the population had any experience of secondary education supplied by the state. Add to that another 5%, 6% going to private schools, and you've got about a fifth of the population with any experience in secondary school. And that just meant they left elementary school at 11 and went to a secondary school, and then often left within a couple of years after that without any qualifications.
Brilliant. And then so it changes in the 20th century, and a lot of people rightly point to the 1944 Butler Act. So could you talk to us a little bit about that? What's its significance? What does it do? How does it change who's in education and to what level?
So in 1902, going back to the beginning of the century, local authorities in England were now allowed to provide secondary education. In Wales, it had happened a little bit earlier. Scotland, somewhat different, but England only starts in 1902. Up until the Butler Act in 1944, the secondary education that local authorities provided was partly fee-paying for those who could afford it, and partly subsidized or free for those who couldn't. But most so-called state school places and secondary schools up to 1944 were still fee-paying because only about a quarter of the state-educated secondary students were getting state support. That's what changes in 1944. It doesn't come in immediately. It takes a while to phase it in. But in all of the four nations of the United Kingdom, through different pieces of legislation, the Butler Act is the one that applies to England and Wales, but there are parallel legislations for Northern Ireland and Scotland. Northern Ireland, actually, I have to say, it comes in quite a bit later, but in any case, eventually, all four nations of the United Kingdom, the principle is that all local authorities have to provide free secondary education to all of their young people. So that means at 11, everyone, theoretically, has to transfer to a secondary school, and that secondary school place has to be free.
So was that then where the original 11 plus came from?
Well, yes and no. I mean, in the period before the Second World War, when local authorities and charitable grammar schools were selecting a minority of people to go to secondary school of any kind, they had to have a means of selection. And it was a much more diverse tapestry. Every local authority did it differently. Every school did it differently, frankly. But something like the 11 plus, a scholarship exam, as it was usually called then, because what you were doing was you were taking an exam both to see whether you were eligible for the grammar school, but also whether if you had the required, if you'd gone to state elementary school, then you could have a scholarship, or you could have free place. And so schools had to have an exam to decide whether kids were up to it, and then whether if they qualified, they deserved a scholarship. So there were 11 plus exams before 1944, but the importance of the Butler Act and of the legislation across the United Kingdom requiring transfer is that it became national. And not everyone took it, because there were still lots of people who it was assumed would never really, in a million years, be able to hack an academic course at secondary level, and those people weren't put through the trial of doing an exam, but most people did. So that's when the 11 plus becomes a national exam. And what that points to is the interesting, and again, often neglected fact, that when the Butler Act says, okay, up until now, only 14% of kids have gone to state-funded secondary, now 100%. What do you do with those 100%? I mean, and basically it was up to every local authority to decide for itself what to do, but what most local authorities did is said, all right, we already have these grammar schools. They take about 14% of the age cohort. Let's keep them pretty much as they were before the war. And we can actually expand because of an interesting demographic fluke, which was that the birth rate had been very low before the war because of the slump, the depression. People were having small families. And so actually the grammar schools had a lot of capacity to expand. And so basically they take the existing schools and they use the 11 plus to decide who's going to go to those existing schools, somewhat expanded, so we're now talking about 20 or 25% of the age cohort that can go to these schools. Much less attention was paid to what was going to happen to the other 75%. Those schools didn't exist. No one knew what they were supposed to do. All they knew was they were for people who had failed the 11 plus and who couldn't therefore be expected to do an academic course, couldn't take what became O levels and A levels. And many of those schools, again, because of the demographic slump below the war, those schools, the elementary schools were undersubscribed as well. Many of the post-war secondary schools for the people who failed the 11 plus were just elementary schools that were relabeled as secondary schools. Secondary modern schools was the most common label, although again, every local authority did it differently. And they were just glorified elementary schools that had been sometimes they literally took elementary schools and just chopped them in half and said the left side are the kids go up to 11, and then at 11 they'll move to the secondary school on the right-hand side, which was a transfer as required by the Butler Act, but it was a bit of a cheat, wasn't it? And there were still, right up until the 60s, lots of so-called all-age schools where actually you didn't even transfer from one part of the school to another, you just sailed on from 11 to 15, which was the new school leaving age. But it's as a result of this, weeding out of the academic minority from the rest and sending the academic minority to the existing grammar schools, it's a result of that process, which becomes nearly universal after the war, that the 11 plus gets enshrined as some kind of rite of passage for young people. We sometimes say nowadays that people took this for granted and that it was just the norm and everyone did it. But that's not true in two different respects. One is, first of all, every local authority did it differently, and not every local authority did that. And then the other thing is that, for most parents, sending their children to secondary school at all was a big mystery. So they hadn't expected their kids to be given an exam at 11 and sent to some other school. That wasn't part of their own experience. They just stayed at elementary school until they were 14 or 13. So the 11 plus springs, more or less, not entirely, but more or less, full blown from nothing after the war. And it almost immediately starts to break down. So again, the idea that the 11 plus was some kind of the standard way of operating secondary education in this country since time immemorial, it just doesn't hold water. Mm-hmm. It's a very short period where you get what's now called in the academic literature either the bipartite or the tripartite system, the idea that kids are being selected to go to one of two different kinds of schools, or at most three different kinds of schools, because some local authorities had a technical school in between the grammar school and the secondary modern school, and those kids were selected by exam as well to go to those. But not many local authorities did have those schools. So this so-called bipartite or tripartite system, it was never a system, and it didn't last for very long.
Yes, you've spoken about, kind of hinted at it breaking down, and we'll move on to that. But could you maybe speak to the different experiences of those children who either pass the 11 plus and go through into these grammar schools, or fail the 11 plus and are into secondary modern schools in whatever that looks like? Of course, you have a couple that are in the technical schools, but ultimately that's not the defining experience. What's kind of the significance of that? What are those experiences like for those children?
Yeah, it's worth just saying a word about technical schools, because I'm not going to say anything more about it after this. And also, it is another one of those myths that it really requires a little bit of scrutiny. I mean, it's often said that Britain, like Germany, ought to have had a proper tripartite system where academic kids went to academic courses and technically proficient kids went to technical schools, and other kids went to, well, the majority were always going to go to some kind of school that didn't have any obvious identity. So that was always going to be a problem. But anyway, it's sometimes said that our failure to do that was responsible for the failure of industrial success and the economic success. And the fact is that most local authorities didn't develop technical schools, either because they didn't actually think that you could select out technically proficient children at 11 or 13, which was when technical schools were usually selected for, or they didn't want to have kids go to a secondary modern school at 11 and then go to a different school at 13, or it was just too expensive to equip an entire set of schools with technical equipment. It wasn't really clear technical equipment for what. I mean, I don't know about you, Jack, you're a young person, but in my generation, if you had to do woodworking and metalworking, and that was technical education. How many people in the post-war world became woodworkers or metalworkers? No one did. It wasn't a good training for anything. So it wasn't really clear that technical education had a future. And in fact, some grammar schools were very well equipped with technical facilities, because what local authorities decided is that, well, we're going to have two kinds of schools. We're going to have secondary modern schools for most kids, and then a school for either academically or technically skilled kids altogether. And so they actually did provide the technical facilities. They just provided it in a bipartite system. So that leaves aside the whole question of, did industrial Britain fail? No, not really. Is the lack of woodworking and metalworking, or even technical drawing or lathing at age 14 responsible for Britain's industrial decline? No. Germany, like Britain, has 80% of its population in services now. So, leaving aside that, so most people are put into a grammar or a grammar tech or a secondary modern. Now, what the grammar school was pretty well understood, because they had existed before. I mean, state grammar schools had existed before the war, but private grammar schools had existed since the Middle Ages. And they had developed a certain curriculum and a certain way of doing things. They'd become, in the early 20th century, increasingly emulative of independent schools, of private schools. So they had started playing rugby instead of football. They had gone for school colors, school ties. They divided the kids into houses, and the things that were typical of an independent school. But they were more socially diverse, and they had a more diverse curriculum. But it was really well established what that was. Now, again, as I said earlier, parents didn't necessarily know what these grammar schools were like, because even the parents of grammar school kids, who were more likely to have gone to grammar school themselves, even they mostly hadn't gone to grammar school, because the proportion had grown from about 14% to 25%. So the kids going to grammar school often were kids of people who hadn't gone to secondary school at all. So it was still a bit of an unknown quantity, but at least the schools knew what they were for, and they knew what they had to provide. Secondary modern schools, you had to sort of make it up as you went along. And as I was saying earlier, the idea that there was some major transition point between elementary and secondary education was a novel one. And for many, many schools, it didn't really change very much what happened in the classroom when you, at 11. You moved to maybe another school nearby, or just to another part of the same school. You had a slightly different curriculum. It was slightly more advanced. But a lot of people in secondary modern schools did not experience the move to secondary school as, big school as we think of it today. Very unlike the school for small children that's provided at elementary level. That began to change in the late 50s. And that's maybe a beginning of a new subject, which is when secondary modern schools began actually to look at grammar schools and think, well, why can't we offer what they're offering?
Yeah, and it offers an interesting segue, but I think for one moment while we sit in this space, one of the things that a lot of people who today are opposed to academic selection and are opposed to grammar schools in 2026 say that, well, maybe once grammar schools were good.
Yeah.
Once grammar schools were good for working class students to go through and to advance themselves, to be upwardly mobile, right. And that, again, there was a period of time where that happened, but not anymore. Was that the case?
Well, to a limited extent, yes, because now everyone, more or less, who showed any signs of intellectual promise, in fact, even if you didn't, you had to take an exam. And so at least there was a selection process that seemed more meritocratic, to use the word that was coined to describe this process in the 50s. And of course, you now went to a school that was free, so the barriers that had kept working class kids out of grammar schools before, even if they got a scholarship, they still had to buy uniforms and buy school equipment and go on school trips and also leave the labor market or not enter the labor market. And so their parents had to feel that it was worth them staying out of work. And those are sacrifices a lot of working class families were unable or unwilling to make. After the war, you could say some of those barriers were removed. It was still the case that, if you went to grammar school, you were more or less promising to stay on to school at least to 15, which was the new school leaving age, and probably to 16 and maybe to 18. And again, a lot of working class parents still didn't feel that they could afford to keep their young people out of the labor market that long. But I think the biggest barrier to grammar schools being a source of social mobility was the 11 plus itself. And it didn't take long for researchers to realize that although now there was apparently this meritocratic selection where the hidden talent that was buried in each of us could be winkled out by means of this magic test, it didn't take long for statistically it to be demonstrated that the people who were doing well on the 11 plus tended to come from the same social background as the people who had paid to go to grammar school before the war. In other words, people from middle and upper middle class backgrounds. And working class children, generally speaking, some did better than they had done. Some of these barriers were removed. But the extra advantage for working class kids that the 11 plus provide that might get them into grammar school was small. And that was something that was already by 55, 56 being demonstrated by statisticians. And in fact, the idea of social mobility, which is so much with us today, was more or less invented through observation of the new bipartite system, the new 11 plus system, because policymakers and social scientists thought this is a great experiment. We will find out whether education can be a major motor of social mobility, and the 11 plus applied nationally is a chance to see whether the existing social structure is artificial and whether it will be mixed up by, as I said, finding talent in everyone rather than just in those people who had inherited social standing. But as soon as they started to look at it, they began to realize actually it hadn't worked out the way they'd imagined. And actually they found something that made them even more puzzled, frustrated, and which is still a source of puzzlement and frustration today. They found that actually the 11 plus did a pretty good job of assessing intelligence as measured by an exam, which you would expect, intelligence is defined by passing a certain kind of exam, then passing a certain kind of exam will tell you if you have intelligence. But that didn't change very much the social composition of the selected group. And from that, some people began to say, oh, well, maybe working class people are just, maybe talent is not evenly distributed. Maybe working class people are just born dumb. And there are people who think that today. Of course, I'd say most of the social scientists who observed this moved on a stage and began to think, well, maybe our idea of intelligence as defined by an exam at age 11 is too limited a measure of intelligence, and it doesn't measure potential to acquire intelligence. And that whole idea of education is not something which just drew on innate intelligence, but which helped you acquire intelligence. That was a novelty in the 1950s. But it was a novelty that would then push attempts to reform the educational system and not any longer stick strictly to the 11 plus as a way of measuring potential.
And then finally we'll move on. We've sort of teased the breakdown of the system, and a lot of people would go to 1965, and that period is when it really starts to break down and things start to change and comprehensive schools come in. The Labour government asks all local authorities to submit plans to reorganise their schools along comprehensive lines. So how do we get to that stage? Is that the full story? And what happens from there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important to remind ourselves that not all local authorities started out with the 11 plus and the bipartite system to begin with. I mean, the first local authority to go completely comprehensive was Anglesey in North Wales, which never selected for secondary education, never had the 11 plus. And rural local authorities in particular find it very difficult to provide to concentrate students enough that you could select 25% from a thinly populated area and send them to a school that was anywhere near their home. And so rural local authorities like Anglesey said, oh, well, let's just provide one school for everyone, and we'll find ways of teaching them differently inside those schools, but we won't select. So already in the early 50s, lots of local authorities were thinking that their existing grammar schools couldn't last for long because it was just too inefficient. But more importantly, the generation that's being sent to secondary modern schools after the war, that is kids who are turning 11 from about 1948, 49 onwards, who are being thrown into a new system, which mostly their parents have no experience of, on the basis of the 11 plus. Over the course of the 1950s, as that generation grows and matures, partly for reasons, natural in a democratic society, is that people think, well, why are some kids going to a really good school, by the way, funded, the grammar schools were funded at a funding level way above the level of secondary modern schools per capita. Why are we sending some kids to good schools with high funding levels and other kids to poorer schools with low funding levels? So people just started asking that basic democratic question. Then they started asking also the question, and this is a world in which social mobility is now being considered as something feasible for everyone. You're not confined any longer to your class. Well, why are we going to be confined to, say, working class status because we've gone to a working class school? I mean, why can't our kids have a chance to grow and develop and move upwards in the social scale? And why is the education system apparently an obstacle to that? But actually more directly and more blatantly, secondary modern schools found that they had lots of kids who had failed the 11 plus, who were perfectly capable of passing O levels, and they started offering them O levels. That's what the parents wanted. The parents wanted kids to take exams which would get them white-collar jobs and get them out of the working class. And so if you go back to those social scientists who said, it's sort of puzzling because the people who are passing 11 plus are the people who should pass the 11 plus because they have the measured intelligence which the 11 plus measures, but they don't seem to be more socially diverse. They don't seem to be more working class. And the social scientists who had observed that then observed those same kids having failed the 11 plus, going to a secondary modern school and passing an exam which they were supposed not to be able to pass because they failed the 11 plus. And they were thinking, oh, well, something's happened between the age of 11 and 16. They actually acquired intelligence, even at the school which is not supposed to be cultivating their academic talents. And they can pass the 11 plus. So why have we gone to the trouble of selecting 25% for the grammar schools in the first place when we could just, find internal means in the school for deciding at various stages who can and should take exams and who can't? And so, well before Harold Wilson was elected in 1964, most English local authorities, all Welsh local authorities, and all Scottish local authorities were beginning to plan for a move away from the bipartite system towards what was increasingly known as a comprehensive system, where the 11 plus was no longer administered and all kids went to the same school at 11, where they might then be taught in different ways and for different purposes, but without the humiliation and possibly socially limiting factor of the 11 plus. Also without the expense. I mean, it must be said, especially for the rural authorities, it's much easier to build one big school for a thinly distributed population than it is to build one little school and one larger school. Much easier, cheaper.
I mean, so then that kind of lends us into the later period, and sort of famously, Margaret Thatcher, as Secretary of State for Education, oversees the most kind of reorganisation from a selective to comprehensive lines. So why does that continue to happen, despite the fact that she submitted, or she's withdrawn rather, that request to local authorities to reorganise? So what's happening there? How does it continue to play out? What's the significance that it's such a regional dimension as you've sketched out? And I guess that then ultimately we're pointing towards a question, which is, why are we still here talking about this in 2026, where there are 163 grammar schools? Of course, quite a jump, but what happens from there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one feature that maybe so far has gone unremarked in our conversation, but is really quite striking about Britain, and I actually think is a good feature, is that education has been traditionally very decentralized here, and it's been decentralized because the central state did not think that it should, the way the French and the Germans did, dictate rigidly to the citizenry what they studied and where they studied and how they studied. That education was a form of expression which should be determined much closer to the people. And so it was always devolved to local authorities. And in the Butler Act, it was devolved to local authorities, which is why Anglesey had comprehensive schools. And it's why in the 1950s, these rural local authorities, most of which were conservative, of course, began to move to comprehensive schools. I mean, Sussex and Hampshire were amongst the first, and they were conservative-controlled local authorities to begin to, in the late 50s and early 60s, craft a comprehensive system. Another really innovative model was one adopted by Leicestershire, which was a two-tier secondary model where you went essentially to a lower secondary or a middle school at 11 or maybe even earlier, and then a selection process did happen, but it happened closer to school leaving age, where the people who wanted to stay could go to an upper secondary school and take exams, and anyone could. You didn't have to pass an exam, you just could stay in school. Or if you wanted to leave school, you left school, but there was a transfer point between lower secondary and upper secondary, and that was also a conservative local authority. I mean, ironically, it's worth pointing this out, that Leicester City was a labor-controlled authority and stuck firmly to its bipartite system. It was very proud of its grammar schools. It considered them still, against the evidence, engines of social mobility. And it was the Tory authority, Leicestershire, which abandoned the grammar schools in favor of this new system. So it was happening piecemeal. As you say, Labour, the central government gave, under Labour in 1965, gave the instruction that local authorities should prepare plans for comprehensive reorganisation. The Conservatives, after 1970, withdrew that instruction, but it was still up to the local authorities to decide for themselves. And the impetus was behind comprehensive reorganisation, whatever the coloration of the local authority. Conservatives, Liberals, Labour, they all did it. And Thatcher's role as Secretary of State for Education was simply to sign off. And she did actually have some meetings with Department for Education civil servants, and she said, well, why are we doing this? And they said to her, well, what they said was what civil servants said, the experts say we should do this. In actual fact, it wasn't the experts, it was parents who didn't want their children to fail an exam at 11, which would limit their future prospects. And it was parent power that was pushing local authorities to go comprehensive. But whatever, the civil servants said, oh, the experts say this is the best thing. And so she just said, oh, okay, fine. And so she kept signing these comprehensive orders. And it's just a matter of timing, really. I mean, it began in the late 50s, it accelerated across the 60s, it reached its peak in the early 70s when Thatcher was the minister, and then it began to taper off just because the number of local authorities available that hadn't already committed was shrinking. But, there was a Labour government between 74 and 79, and it tried to encourage all local authorities to continue to complete this process. When Labour left power in 79 and Thatcher came in as Prime Minister, there were still some local authorities that hadn't. And though, basically speaking, oversimplifying a little bit, but not much, that's the situation that we're in today. It got frozen in 1979. Since 1979, not many local authorities have changed the nature of their system, and it's 90-odd% of local authorities are comprehensive. Every single one in Wales and Scotland, and the vast majority in England, and not in Northern Ireland, it's a special case. And then there are these exceptions. One thing that's worth mentioning is that there was in the early 70s, under the Conservative government, something that Thatcher was very much in favor of, a rash of referenda, where local authorities, on their own initiative, held referenda to ask people, did you want to keep the bipartite system, keep grammar schools and secondary moderns, or did you want to convert to comprehensives? And I think without exception, although they often posed the question in ways that it's hard to interpret the results, but I think without exception where you could interpret the result was a very large majority for comprehensive schools. So, insofar as people power was directly expressing itself, it expressed itself in favor of comprehensives, and that was something else that elected governments of either stripe were not likely to stand up against.
Yeah, and of course the local ballot regulation is what we have now as the kind of framework for if local authorities want to move away. It's in the name of the parents. And so moving on a little bit then, and kind of reflecting on why people wanted something different from their education, or why they wanted something to change. We've spoken obviously about how parents wanted their children to take examinations and to go into white-collar jobs. They wanted to move into those more middle-class occupations. So what's happening?
Which, by the way, is what happened, of course. I mean, it had nothing to do with education, I don't think, or not very much. But, of course, most people in working-class jobs did move into middle-class jobs. I mean, about half of the working-class population of the immediate post-war period, their children ended up in white-collar occupations.
Yeah, and I think that's the perfect kind of leading on to what we're then going to discuss is, so what's going on in Britain that distinguishes this period from the mid-1940s? I'm talking about a change in industrial employment, kind of as you're touching on there, talking about increasing participation of women in higher levels of education and in the workforce in various roles, the service sector, perhaps multiculturalism. What are these factors, and are there any others that are significant in what's shaping parents and families' priorities in education, and how's that reflecting a changing picture?
Yeah, so I think we have to start with the 1950s and 60s when you've got a newly democratic country. Don't forget, one person, one vote in this country didn't come in until 1948. That's another story, really. But a newly democratic country and a country with a welfare state for the first time, and a country that was more or less, devoted to equal opportunities for everyone. And in that context, giving people a test at 11, which seemed to determine your life's fate and to either limit or open your opportunities, didn't seem to make sense to most people. And that's why you had parents of kids who'd failed the 11 plus, going to secondary modern, still taking O-levels, still moving into white-collar occupations because their parents were, that's what their parents wanted for them. And that's why you had really a kind of grassroots, I won't say uprising because it didn't really manifest itself in the form of demonstrations and campaigns, but just steady pressure from below, not to get rid of the 11 plus because it just seemed ill-fitted to a democratic society, and give kids a chance to show what they could do in education right up until the moment that they left. So that's the context in which the 11 plus sort of is delegitimized. And pretty much everyone knows by the early 60s that the 11 plus is not long for this world because of public opinion. As we move through that, we are in a period between the mid-40s and the mid-70s where there's massive social mobility. As I said, it probably didn't have much to do with education. It had to do with the changing nature of the economy and the labor market, and the fact that manual jobs are shrinking as a proportion of the total, and service sector and technical and white-collar jobs are growing. And you just have to think about, we don't have coal miners anymore. We don't have very many steel workers. We don't have very many shipbuilders, or indeed manufacturing. It's only about 10-12% of the population of the workforce. We do have lots of shops and offices, and something that we became very aware of, I think rather belatedly in the pandemic, we've got tons of bars and restaurants. We've got people working different kinds of jobs. And so there was huge social mobility that would have happened anyway, regardless of changes in the educational system. But the more comprehensive system seemed like it was at least compatible with, and I think most people still think it was responsible for, this upward social mobility. I never know as an historian whether to disabuse people of that, because if they think that comprehensive schools are good for social mobility, that's not completely wrong. It's slightly misleading, but it's a healthy thing because comprehensive schools are good for other things. On the other hand, you don't want people to be operating under misconceived notions of how society works. I do think one of the big differences between the 50s and 60s and today is that in the 50s and 60s, all of a sudden, everyone was subjected to this test. And now, memory of that test is almost entirely forgotten by 95% of the population. And so it allows people to re-entertain fantasies about, maybe this test is the way of finding the hidden talent in my children, which otherwise would not be properly catered to. And so I think, if you ask people, and I have to say, if you ask people what they think about academic selection at 11, or you ask them what they think of grammar schools, and opinion polls ask people this all the time, the results change dramatically year to year, because people don't really know. And so they answer on the basis of some other idea about something else that happens to have caught their imagination recently. So, but if you ask people generally, they're not exercised by it one way or another, and on the whole, they're more likely to say, sure, it's worth a try. In the same way that because the established political parties, and today we're speaking on the day of the local elections, and it's probably the first election in which we've seen our completely fragmented political system on full display, because we've got 6 parties with more or less equal shares. It never happened before, and people are voting for other parties just because they're sick to the back teeth of the existing system, and they say the same thing about grammar schools. We don't like comprehensive schools, we don't like the schools our kids go to, so let's try something different. But they can say that, and they can entertain those illusions because they haven't been subjected to the 11 plus. And honestly, let's say you get a reform government which is committed to restoring grammar schools, which they are, and they bring back grammar schools everywhere very quickly, which they would presumably want to do. I bet you can guarantee that there will be a mass uprising against, because most people will suddenly realize that their kids are going to be fated to a second class and a second tier education rather than the first tier education that everyone had expected and hoped for.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of the interesting conversations we have at Comprehensive Future is it's so frustrating to get the issue back on the table, and the prospect of a reform government and reform talking about grammar schools kind of gives that opportunity in a way that it's not spoken about very often.
And you, Jack, grew up in a local authority, Lincolnshire, which kept the 11 plus. So you're one of the few young people in the country today who can say something about how it works in practice.
Yeah, indeed, and there's no surprise that we've ended up here. And so, yeah, I guess let's talk about the contemporary debates then. And so, what is missing when we talk about them? They're kind of, grammar schools are invoked, as you say, in a couple of instances. And I mean, thinking of Theresa May talks about it in 2016. Liz Truss doesn't really get round to it, but talks about it in her campaign before she becomes Prime Minister. And then, as you say, Reform are also committed to grammar schools. So what's missing in that debate? And what do we need to know from this historical perspective that will inform us talking about grammar schools, but maybe also selection itself, academic selection more broadly, that we can take from what we've been discussing today?
Yeah, it's interesting. For a long time, academic selection, grammar schools, the 11 plus, was described as the third rail of British politics. No one wanted to touch it because it was so unpopular. Now, because memories have faded, it's not so unpopular. But nevertheless, it's still quite striking that apart from Reform, including the Conservatives, no party has been willing to say outright, we're going to bring back the 11 plus for all of our 11-year-olds. And I think that reflects a residual uneasiness on the part of the electorate that that's not a good idea. But it also means, of course, that the issue has been taken off the agenda, and it's very hard for people to get people to make a more positive statement about an unselected secondary education, and the political parties who are not willing to endorse selection are also not willing to override the existing local authorities which continue to select, and they're not even willing to raise it as a major issue in political discourse. It just seems to be too complicated and too controversial on either side, and there's no need to address it because 90% of the population are in comprehensive schools, and though there might be dissatisfaction with your child's school, you're not immediately leaping to the idea that therefore my child should have been given an exam at 11 and assigned to a school on that basis. So I think it's just way down the agenda. If you wanted to raise it up the agenda, and which of course I do, because I do think it's an important thing. Here again, as a scholar, I feel ambivalent because my arguments for comprehensive education are not necessarily the ones that most advocates of comprehensive education would like to embrace. They would like to say it's about social mobility, and I don't think it is. I mean, here again, social scientists have been able to do natural experiments, both comparing social mobility in periods when there was selection with social mobility in periods when there wasn't. That's hard because as with change over time, everything changes and you can't hold anything constant. But you can also do a national experiment by comparing social mobility in a local authority that, like Lincolnshire or Kent, which retains selection, and social mobility in a local authority that doesn't. And you'd have to again control for the different social compositions of those populations, because Buckinghamshire, for example, which is another generally pro-selection local authority, and Kent, they have a unusual population determined by their proximity to London. But you can control for those things, and actually what you find when you do that is that actually there's not much difference in social mobility between local authorities that select and don't select. What I would do is turn that around and say, well, okay, so it doesn't really matter that much for social mobility, but if it doesn't matter for social mobility, why are you doing it? And what are the costs of doing it? The costs are, creating a lot of pressure and on 9, 10, 11-year-olds, a lot of competition, a lot of test anxiety, of what used to be known as exam neurosis, without any advantages. That is, if all of those things just made for a go-get-'em population, which was, soaring ahead and intellectually and socially as a result of being tested in the crucible of the 11 plus, you might think that was a good thing. But actually, that has not been the outcome, because, as I say, it hasn't had any effect on social mobility. There's no evidence really that it's had any effect on the overall cognitive performance of the population either. So if the if the advantages of competition at 11 don't exist, then you have to ask, what are the disadvantages? And I think the disadvantages are that they create a lot of tension and anxiety and division in communities which need, especially nowadays, not to be divided but to be united. And as people remembered in the 50s and 60s, when they were being subjected to this very divisive exam, and also then being given a first-class service or a second-class service, people remembered in the 50s and 60s, it's not suitable for a democratic society. To treat, I mean, obviously in a democratic society, you don't expect everyone to be exactly equal their whole lives, but you do expect children to be given equal opportunities, or I do. I don't see any particular value in putting young people through this academically selective ordeal at 11, which is also socially selective and has never been anything other than socially selective. Kids from more advantaged backgrounds do better on the 11 plus under all circumstances in all places. I don't see any advantages in a democratic society to having that ordeal, and I see plenty of disadvantages. This may seem to be a rather more complicated or idealistic argument than the simple one, which is that your child deserves to be rich and famous, and if they fail the 11 plus, they will be denied that chance. But I don't think that simple, maybe superficially attractive argument actually either has any intellectual integrity or is the strongest argument for comprehensive schooling.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's brilliant. And I think those arguments of kind of community and of exams resonate. Sort of to offer the anecdotal example of it, when I failed that 11 plus at first and then went to the grammar school for sixth form. And you can imagine that we have plenty of conversations about that at various pubs and cafes across Lincolnshire when I'm at home. And it's ultimately what we talk about. We talk about the pressure that young children had on exams, even when they got to maybe the grammar school as well. The pressure on academic kind of validation, on that culture, that's what they were selected for, and that has something to your identity and to your belonging when you're selected for the grammar school. And then again, you talk about social selection, because you're kind of sat in your mid-20s, sat with people who were selected for the grammar school and people who are at the secondary modern, but ultimately that's quite rare and is not something that happened. You get so split up at the end of primary school, and so to kind of come back and yeah, you talk about community, you don't talk about social mobility necessarily. It's part of the story and is of course those pro arguments, but I think that's the more convincing and deep argument that is rooted as well in that history that we've spoken about.
Yeah, and every child deserves a chance, and the chance shouldn't be cut off at 11. I mean, as I said, I mean, we don't expect in a democratic society everyone to end up the same place, when they're my age. But the longer you can push that sort of seeking and finding potential, the better. And I mean, a lot of places do select. I mean, you're going to the sixth form, having failed the 11 plus, shows that there is other forms of selection still in the system. Even in comprehensive local authorities, I live in Cambridgeshire. Not everyone, but a lot of people move to a sixth form college at 16. Those sixth form colleges have entrance requirements, which essentially amount to a certain degree of selection, although actually they're much lower entrance requirements than you might think. So that, and I teach at Cambridge University, where obviously a great deal of academic selection is taking place at 18. But to push it back to 11 would seem to be a retrograde step, and as I say, deny many children the chance to acquire intelligence and to show potential.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.